Attention! By decree of the Lord of Holy Terror and by extension the God Emperor of Mankind, queries into the recorded archives you are requesting are strictly prohibited. By querying such information of a prohibited nature is tantamount to heresy. As an act to such, it is an account and the God Emperor is a free and edict. You are thusly a heretic. As a convicted heretic, you are in violation of the following. Article 1073P, DAC 977864/211/.
Junior Engine Seer Jim had spent the last few days discussing the problem with Junior Engine Seer Hannah. Neither of them had managed to think of any clever solutions, and there was no one else to turn to. Asking the senior tech priest for advice was right out, since they were half the problem anyways, and old Bill just didn't understand the issue. In the end, it was decided that their only option was to approach the problem directly, which is to say, Jim would approach the problem directly. Hannah refused to go anywhere near that section of the ship. During the next nightly 75-minute organic recuperation period, Jim visited the storage room across from the Gellerfield generator. Remembering it was Tuesday and after 1800, he bypassed the first two doors and made his way to the third, where the mechanical keypad he'd expected had been replaced by a data slate and a piece of yellow paper. Jim tried to ignore the claymore mine mounted underneath the slate as he read the note. It was labeled, "Prove you're not a servitor or orc." A second smaller note said, "Case sensitive." It took 2 tries to get the illegible series of handwritten letters entered into this slate. Luckily, the mine had only armed, and the slate had instructed him not to move after the first mistake. Jim thought it was rather unfair to expect someone to be able to tell the difference between a lowercase and a capital S. Then the door finally opened, and the engine seer made his way down a zigzagging corridor of sandbags. As he walked, he idly wondered where they'd managed to find sand on a void ship, and then decided he was happier not knowing. When Jim came around the last bend, he found 3 of them, and he'd come to see them piling up pieces of burnt meat and metal into a wheelbarrow. He ignored what looked like the remains of an unfortunate maintenance servitor, and hesitantly asked if the interrogator was present, or maybe even Doc. The shortest and most amiable of the 3 troopers, Nubby, explained that Sarge was working with the adepts and Doc was staying in the medbay on the account of his legs not working. Several complex and undeniably obscene gestures accompanied this, either conveying Nubby's opinion of the adepts, or what he thought Doc's actual reason for staying in the medbay was. Jim wasn't sure which. Twitch interrupted the show to ask Jim if he was here about the servitor, because that was entirely not Twitch's fault. He clearly explained that no one was to attempt to clean or do maintenance in this room without an escort. Also, sharing access code, even if it was a servitor, was a severe violation of proper security protocol. Actually, change that to especially if it was a servitor. Those damn things can't be trusted. Jim should know. He'd been there and seen what the psychotic murder machines had done the second they got a chance. Jim shuddered at the memory Twitch's rant dredged up, then turned to the 3rd Guardsman. While the other 2 had been talking, Tink had been having a quiet, one-sided argument with a small Xenotech data slate he was holding. Occasionally, he'd switch from swearing at the controller to cooing at the hovering disk in front of him as it tried, with mixed success, to pick up pieces of servitor with its small servo arm. Jim summoned every scrap of courage he could muster and walked up to the goggle-wearing guardsman.
"Take this, TeknoAXEsongs needs to stop. If you don't destroy that unholy Xenos contraption, I will. Oh, please don't kill me.
Tink pressed the humming plasma gun, which Jim swore he hadn't been holding a second ago, a little harder into the engine seer's chest. In the most threatening voice he could muster, Tink asked, "What did you just call my waifu?" Nubby came to Jim's rescue before long. He carefully pushed the plasma gun to the side and reminded Tink that Sarge had banned the W word. Furthermore, this was Jim, the broest of cogboys. He was definitely on the do not blow in half with a plasma gun list, and hadn't meant to insult Tink's favorite toy. There was undoubtedly a reason behind the request, and if everyone would just settle down, this could all be sorted out without Sarge yelling at anyone. Tink grumbled on it not being a toy. She was DX-9F, exploratory drone, configured for stealth operations and tech interfacing, and her name was Hana 2.0. Jim went blank as he processed this, then started sputtering a mix of shock and revulsion. Nubby groaned and waved a hand at Twitch, who obliged by pegging the ranting trooper in the back of the head with a chunk of servitor. Both parties were hauled off and seated in front of one of the several whiteboards that had gone missing from the official briefing rooms. Jim boggled at the list on the board as Nubby forced the surly Tink to read the last 6 items on it.
Number 6. The drone does not have agenda at all. Number 7. The drone is not named Hannah or Phil What's-It. Number 8. The drone is not named after anyone, regardless if we've met them. Number 9. The drone is named Spot. It is a good name. It is actually sort of witty. All complaints must be handwritten and submitted in person to Interrogator Sarge. Number 10. Anyone who violates these rules or actually submits a complaint will be made to suffer in ways they could not possibly imagine. After the base rules were re-established and Tink had accepted that no one was going to be allowed to shoot anyone unless it was Twitch and there was an orc attack, Nubby asked Jim what the problem was. If he was here about our recent acquisitions, it should be obvious that we had the situation in hand. Everyone was aware of the Mechanicus' little rules about Xenotech and would be keeping a low profile, so no worries. None of us were ready for the explosion that the phrase "little rules" triggered. The young engine seer leapt out of his seat and started pacing back and forth, frantically explaining that this wasn't a matter of laws or protocols. This was dogma. See, the cowboy tends to be a little bit more religious when it comes to technology than most guardsmen, which isn't surprising. They're called tech priests, after all. But the exact nature of their religion is a little complex. Some of them loved all tech, especially the old and complex stuff, and would go around worshipping random things they dug out of space hulks. Others were all for getting and keeping their technology working as well as possible, or maybe even pulling apart things to see how they worked. Some cogboys, though, were completely focused on stamping out any piece of tech, no matter how amazing, that didn't originate from Mars. According to Jim, about half the senior tech priests on the ship fell into that last category. Jim claimed these were the sort of guys that would destroy any device they suspected of being Xenos-made. They'd also convert anyone who'd ever used it into servitors, then push the servitors into a plasma reactor. Nubby suggested that this was a bit of an exaggeration. The Inquisition always got a fair bit of leniency on this stuff. Didn't that interrogator with the big hat have a sword that whispered at anyone nearby about drinking their blood? What about Sister What's-Her-Face that had that stern guard pattern bolter she looted from a dead Marine?
and no one commented on the fact that the guy running the recruitment had actually purchased a medium-sized tropical island with the funds he'd been embezzling over the last few decades. Surely a little Xenotech could be swept under the same rug those guys were using. Jim just shook his head and pointed out that all those were things that the Inquisition typically had jurisdiction over. Believe it or not, hardcore Orthodox tech priests were a lot less forgiving. Jim suggested that, as a baseline, we imagine a 300-year-old redemptionist preacher. Now combine that with a general cranky outlook with the fact that the Orthodox tech priest on the ship had been forced to accept that most of its critical engineering staff were not members of the machine cult. These guys were itching to put someone in their place. If anyone caught their attention with a clear case of tech heresy, their lifespan would be measured in minutes. So, Jim was asking, begging really, that we give up our suicidal fascination with Xenotech. Everyone went quiet for a while as they processed this. Tink frowned at his drone controller, Twitch pondered how many servitors the priest commanded, and Nubby weighed the value of his life against that of a crate of Tau Pulse weapons. All of us looked at each other and then came to a silent agreement. Nubby thanked Jim for his warning. It really opened our eyes to the situation. He promised that he would be very careful not to show their new toys to any of the tech priests, except for Jim and Hana. Oh, and the other guys we couldn't remember whose names of, but they were pretty cool for cowboys. Jim sank into his seat and looked like he was about to start crying. While Twitch and Tink went back to cleaning, Nubby did his best to console the young engine seer. Eventually, his weaselly arguments about how unlikely the senior priests were to find out, if no one ratted them out, that is, calmed Jim down. From there, it wasn't hard to convince him to help with the quote-unquote disguise the Xenotech project. Given how much damage a minor war located across the hull from a Gallo-filled generator would cost, Nubby argued it could even be budgeted under preventative ship maintenance. The engineer grudgingly sat down at the workbench Tink had been using for a project and started tinkering. He didn't even pause to question the origins of the pile of slightly used las guns or the large crate of assorted human and animal skulls that had been provided for camouflage material. He'd made some real progress and was even managing a near civil technical discussion with Tink when Sarge came back. Sarge, who'd spent the last 20 hours over the last few days trying to fill the gaps in his team left by Doc's injury and the infiltrator's death, took Jim's presence as a sign from the Emperor. Before the night was over, the paperwork was in order and the engineer was officially seconded to us for the duration of the upcoming mission. Jim was not exactly happy about this. That upcoming mission was a bit of a mystery. Our little op in the Tau border world had gone relatively well. We foiled a rather convoluted plot to get neutral worlds in bed with the Tau Empire and killed the raiders that had been terrorizing the area. At least we'd thought that the rogue traitor we'd doomed to an incredibly gruesome death was behind all the missing colonies and stations. Turned out to be his band of pirates didn't quite fit the bill, though. It's not like they didn't have it coming. No one but Doc felt guilty about trapping those mercenary bastards in the warp with no Gellerfield, but according to our reports, whoever was wiping out the locals didn't leave bodies. Not theirs, not their victims either. That was pretty ominous, especially coupled with the fact that a few other Inquisitional teams of our own little expedition had been on those worlds. None of them had sent out any message. They just vanished with the civvies. Yeah, ominous. All those guys had been the same as us. Small teams of underfunded,
underinformed, and undered everything else Inquisitional agents sent out to look for trouble or do something for Oak. We were definitely the last people to suggest that they should have been able to stop the colony eradicating doom thingy, but we had expected them to at least get something out. Even if it was just an after-pass message saying, "Shit, Tyranids," or
I feel the warp overtaking me. It is a good pain.
they didn't though, which meant that whatever had gotten them was even weirder than usual. All we had to go on was the information the Incurrence Board's captain had scrounged for us when the teams had missed their pickups. He had a rough map of which systems had been wiped out for sure, and a few notes from one of the colonies he personally inspected. That's how we knew he was worried. The captain didn't like going down to planets. He said they were untidy. The disappearances charted a sort of winding path through the region, starting on the fringe of Tau space and twisting in the general direction of the Imperium. That was the whole reason we got involved in this mess. None of us gave a shit if a bunch of Xenos got killed or really cared much about fringe worlds, but if the pattern continued, some valuable Imperial worlds were going to get wiped out. So, Oak had mandated that everyone out here were to drop what they were doing and figure out what the hell was going on. The Incurrence Border had picked up all the teams it could reach in time and was going to do its best to follow the trail before it got cold. Sarge spent a lot of time working with the Adepts and the other teams to figure out what we were in for before we ran into it. Sarge had sat down with the captain, who he got along with rather better than the other interrogators, and gone over the whole thing from top to bottom. Unfortunately, all they were able to figure out was that the path mostly followed decent warp routes, which told us whoever was driving was probably using a warp drive, or they just felt like going that way. The captain's brief visit to the purged colony had turned up some more useful info. He described the place as being mostly intact, but with no creatures, living or dead. There was some battle damage, but the place hadn't been nuked from orbit, and he said it didn't look like the fight lasted long. Sarge tried to pick his brain for details about the battle damage, hoping to pin down what sort of weaponry had been used. The captain wasn't much help though. All he was able to tell us was that no one had used macro cannons, lances, torpedoes, or nova cannons. Oh, and someone had dropped several million tons of powdered silica and organic matter on the place. That struck him as interesting. A few probing questions revealed that this mysterious substance was, in fact, just the ground. Bloody spacers. It was eventually decided that the only way we get anything useful was by visiting one of the worlds and looking around ourselves, preferably after the mysterious people disappearing thing had left. Until then, all anyone could do was wildly speculate, so we did what any red-blooded guardsman would do in this situation. We started a betting pool. At first, it was the usual small wages between us, everyone sticking to their pet theories and so on, but Nubby smelled profit and the thing quickly grew to ludicrous size. Within a few days, both the other teams, the entire engineering department, and half the ship's officers were in on it. There had even been a runner from the Navigator's Sanctum carrying bets from him and the Astropath, neither of whom had been told about the pool. That sparked a lengthy debate on whether those guys could see the future and if it should invalidate their bets. In the end, Nubby held that if they could, then they'd been able to avoid being assigned to the Incurrence Border, so he took their money like everyone else. There would wind up being only 3 popular bets since various factors wound up disqualifying most of the candidates. No one was willing to put money on it being a human force on the account that Oak would have known if there was a rogue Inquisition fleet out here, and Chaos Warbands or cultists were never this tidy. On the Xenos side, the Tau didn't fit. Necrons tended to stick to their tomb worlds. Tyranids either left planets barren or full of Tyranids.
And even Twitch couldn't figure out how it could be orcs. That just left warpy stuff, Eldar, or some really obscure type of Xenos. Sarge and Doc had their money on some sort of crazy warp shit, either a greater demon or some sort of massive phenomena. They didn't have any real reason behind the theory, but since it was the scariest thing anyone could think of, it had the lock on a pessimistic vote. Outside of the pool, all the adepts who knew anything about warpy stuff were going through their records trying to figure out what could be done if they were right. Meanwhile, after Twitch gave up on the orcs, he had gone down to the adepts and gotten a list of all the types of Xenos that lived on the fringe. He didn't sleep for 3 days after that, and eventually had to be tranked by Doc. Well, by his girlfriend. Doc wasn't in any condition to chase down Twitch on the account of the whole wheelchair thing. Anyways, after he was pried out of his hole, Twitch made a fairly strong case for some obscure Xeno horrors being behind everything. Even Tink and our team's adepts threw in with him, neither because they believed him or just thought it was good odds to play the fields. Then finally, the popular bet was on the OCD Eldar Raiders theory. Nubbies and Fumbles had stated that, won by wholly denying that it was even a possibility. The denial had come right after they'd received the Navigator's bet, and even if most folks couldn't figure out why the Eldar would be disappearing colonies, they knew what a rigged game looked like. Nubby hadn't gotten any sympathy from the rest of us when he complained about how even the odds were getting. Between the pool, Tink and Jim's project, and Sarge scrambling to prepare the mission, Doc was the only one of us with much free time. Of course, that was primarily because he was stuck in a wheelchair until his legs and gut wound finished healing. He spent most of that time in the medbay acting as a handy, capable nurse for his girlfriend, and despite Nubby's consistent barrage of tasteless jokes, seemed to be coping with the temporary crippling fairly well. We mostly left him to it, since we risked death by either sap overdose or angry hospitaller every time we visited. Twitch nearly lost an ear to a thrown scalpel when he kidnapped the poor boy for a night of recreational drinking. While Doc wasn't too bothered about his injury, it was a constant source of worry for the rest of us. Not because we thought he wouldn't get better, but because the captain had spotted a world in the right direction that had gone dark and was taking us there for a little reconnoitering. Our ETA was a few days, and Doc's recovery was a matter of weeks or months, so it was looking like we going into the field without a medic. Sarge and Jim tried to convince us that the Mediskulls they'd requisitioned was just as good, but we weren't buying it. Those things are unsettling just to look at. They're a million times worse when you've just been shot and one's coming at you with a buzzsaw. Everyone was feeling a little nervous when we finally came out of warp and confirmed that the nearby planet was emptier than a Minotaurum's agent's heart. Those of us that weren't creeped out by the prospect of nosing around a freshly depopulated world were wondering if we were about to lose 3 weeks' pay in the pool. While everyone worried and prepped their gear, Sarge attended to one final meeting with the captain and the 2 other interrogators. Now, these guys weren't bad sorts, at least by officer standards, but neither of them really played well with others. One was a blonde battle axe of an ex-cleric, and the other was a serious agent fellow, with a creepy sword that no one commented on. Battle Axe had been drumming up recruits, and Sword Guy had been trouble-stabbing some problem for Oak before the new orders came through. Neither of them were very happy about being reassigned mid-mission. Despite their unhappiness, they'd treated Sarge well enough, and their adepts had worked with ours in data processing. But no one was willing to accept anyone but themselves as mission leader. That included Sarge, who would immediately recognize 2 people who wouldn't blink at sacrificing a few guardsmen. Since no one was feeling overly cooperative, the basic plan was for each team to send a separate party to the dead planet and look for clues. If anyone found anything interesting, they'd call for the adepts. If anyone found hostiles, they'd call for reinforcements from the ship or the other teams. It wasn't the most efficient plan, but without some clear and present danger, it was the best one we could get. The final meeting between the three interrogators and the captain was to determine who would go where on the planet and how much support the occurrence border would provide. The planet was sort of shitty and probably had a population of only 5 to 6 million before it got wiped out. BattleAxe called dibs on what passed for the local center of government, and Sword Guide wanted to take his team to the largest commercial shuttle port. Sarge carefully considered the remaining options, then ignored the pointed suggestions that he'd inspect the planet's only military base in favor of the smallest shuttle port on the planet. Sarge carefully deflected their questions about his choice with vague comments about hunches and feelings. He managed to hold out until the captain got annoyed and forced the discussion move along. It was agreed that the occurrence border would hang in stationary orbit and handle communications while each team was given their own shuttle. The emergency support option consisted of the remaining 2 shuttles loaded with all the armsmen the captain thought he could reasonably spare on his ship's lances. Everyone was reminded that the last time those lances were used at that range, they missed by 17 kilometers and had to be walked, while still firing at full power and jiggling a lot to the target. The captain recommended not asking for any precision strikes, then called an end to the meeting. Sarge gathered us up at the shuttle bay for a final briefing before we went down. The ground team consisted of everyone except the adepts, who would be hanging out in the comms room and analyzing whatever we sent them. And Doc was only there to wish us luck before he went to get the medbay ready for whoever got shot this time. Hannah and old Bill were there too, mostly to remind us that Jim was considered essential to the smoothest running of the ship. It would go poorly for us if he came back in anything less than factory fresh condition. Our briefing started with Sarge acknowledging that randomly walking around a deserted planet, quote-unquote, looking for clues, was about the stupidest way of gathering information invented. This stole Tink and Nubby's thunder and shut them up long enough for Sarge to explain our real mission, which was to hang out within support range of the other 2 teams. If something was going to try to kill nosy people, it'd probably start with them, and we'd be in good position to swoop in and save the day, or make a clean escape. All we had to do was stay near the shuttle and keep out of trouble while the people who actually knew what a clue looked like did the hard work. It was a very good plan. The cherry on top was the location Sarge picked for us. He'd chosen it for 3 reasons. Firstly, he figured that running around a military factory was probably filled with partially activated defenses and undetonated ordnances was incredibly stupid, and no other location really had anything tailored to our skills. Secondly, it was pretty much between the other 2 teams, which would make supporting them easier. Finally, the planet's climate was cold and wet, and that tropical island shuttleport was the only credible location that wasn't currently being rained, snowed, or sleeted on. So yeah, we were going there because it looked like it was going to be a pleasant day at the beach. Doc and his girlfriend looked vaguely jealous as we boarded the shuttle. We'd been offered a pilot for our shuttle, but 2 of us were qualified to fly the thing, and we preferred to have someone who we really trusted in charge of our only transport. Also, Nubby pointed out that they might ride us out to the other teams. Tink and Jim had a brief, heated debate about who was pilot and co-pilot, which ended poorly for both of them when their slap fight over the joystick knocked over Sarge's recaf. Aside from the brief excitement provided by Sarge chewing out the techies, the ride down was fairly boring. Even the view out the window was dull. The top half of the planet was white with snow, the bottom half was mostly water or clouds, and even Nubby couldn't find any obscene-looking continents. Twitch tried to liven things up by speculating on what type of Xeno horrors had abducted everyone and what unspeakable things they were being done to them, but stopped when Fumbles looked like he was going to start crying. Our first look at the shuttleport confirmed Sarge's genius. The place was obviously built as some sort of vacation resort for rich merchants. A quick flyover turned up a complete lack of people, vehicles, or Xenos monstrosities, and an environment scan revealed nothing more dangerous than a chance of sunburn. So we went down right on there, the beach. There was a final comms check and reiteration of the ground rules. Then everyone went off to enjoy themselves. Now, you might be getting the impression that we weren't taking our mission seriously as it warranted, and anyone from the other teams would have certainly said so. There's a difference between not being serious and not being effective, though, and we fully intended to complete the objectives we set for ourselves. Since in our eyes, our main objective was to be ready to save the other team's bacon, everyone stayed within sprinting distance of the shuttle, and Jim kept its engines warmed up. In defense of the fact that this was potentially hostile territory, everyone outside the shuttle stuck in groups, and Twitch worked with Jim to set up a rudimentary perimeter around the LZ. Finally, Spot the Wonder Drone was feeding everything it saw to the adepts, and we were definitely keeping our eyes open as we strolled around the beach and inspected all the bungalows. Admittedly, Nubby was the one doing most of the inspecting, but it wasn't like anyone was expecting to find anything anyways. Sarge picked through the beach chairs until he found one that didn't have a big, vaguely human-shaped hole in it, and made himself comfortable. He lounged in the sun and listened to the other team's comms traffic. From the sound of it, the battle axe had already spotted the silhouettes and didn't need to be pointed towards them. The burly non-com laid back and idly watched as Twitch built some truly impressive sandcastles. Jim elected to stay in the shuttle, claiming that sand was bad for his metal bits, but sent a few servo skulls and chatted with Tink over the comm. The techie had yanked off the 2 grok skulls his drone had been encased in and was nauseating the adepts, trying to watch the vid feed by racing it against Jim's skulls. When they started arguing whether ramming was allowed and if busting through walls should count as a penalty, Sarge made them switch to hide and seek. While everyone stayed near the shuttle, Nubby grabbed Fumbles and went to do an exhaustive search of the nearby buildings. At first, it was for small and valuable items that might need a new home, but after a while, Nubby realized that he was being unprofessional. A few minutes later, he and Fumbles had acquired a wheelbarrow and switched to searching for large and valuable items that might need a new home. Fumbles happily pushed the barrel and learned several important lessons about the difference between looting and recycling. Everything was going splendidly, and Sarge considered taking a nap when Twitch screamed, "Movement!" and dove into a freshly dug sand trench. Despite the amount of shit the rest of us gave Twitch over his paranoia, we all trusted his spotting skills with our lives. Within seconds, Sarge and Tink landed in the trench next to him, and overhead the drone engaged his stealth field. On the far side of the shuttle, Nubby and Fumbles dropped their loot and got ready to either flank or sprint to safety. The only person who didn't respond immediately was Jim, who poked his head out of the shuttle door to see what all the fuss was about. Sarge screamed at the cog boy to get back into cover and drove the point home by chucking a nearby entrenching tool at the opened hatch. The shovel barely missed Jim's head, and he scrambled back in with a little yelp while the rest of us tried to spot whatever Twitch had seen. When nothing happened over the next few minutes, Sarge started ordering Tink, Jim, and Fumbles to scan the area. Before he managed to finish the order, a buzzing sound cut in and told us to
remain in your current position and cease communication. Your vessel will be yielded to our service.
Everyone pegged the voice as a tech priest of some variety. Anyone else with an augmented voice box would have at least tried to make it sound normal. This guy sounded like a cross between a garbage disposal and an opera singer. Everyone was still processing this development when Tink's knee-jerk response kicked in and he screamed, "Jamming up your ass, you techno-fascist!" into his comm bead. Instead of an explosion of angry binary or an immediate attack, the awkward silence was broken by a second voice exploding into laughter. It wasn't exactly happy laughter. It had a definite hysterical edge to it and went far longer than Tink's comment warranted. As we sat and waited for it to peter out, Sarge cut his comm and asked Twitch if he recognized the voice. Both of them agreed that the speaker was female and someone they'd met before, but couldn't pin it down. Sarge was on the edge of interrupting and asking for some identification when the tech priest commanded the woman to, quote, cease her frivolity. This did not go over well. You know how some people argue like old married couples and it's sorta cute to watch? Well, this wasn't anything like that. They argued like, well, two people who had been stuck on a desert island together for far too long. Or one person and one damaged blender. It wasn't just an awkward to listen to, it was actually a little scary. Weeks or months of pepped-up venom poured out in a nearly incomprehensible triad from the woman and the priest, countered with commands for silence and bursts of binary. It only got harder to listen to when the cogboy cut his comms and she left hers on. Now that she was talking, most of us recognized the woman's voice, and at Sarge's orders, we followed the sound of the argument. After a few blocks of walking, we found a familiar guardswoman, face gone crimson, screaming at a senior-looking tech priest. They were standing in the middle of a half-looted convenience store with a half-dozen servitors forming a menacing-looking ring around the woman. Nubby and Twitch grabbed Tink before he could do anything stupid, and Sarge awkwardly cleared his throat. To everyone's surprise, especially Sarge's, the argument came to a sudden halt. Our fearless leader was nearly knocked off his feet as the guardswoman screamed his name and tackled him. Nubby took a picture. While being tackled by a heavily armed and moderately attractive woman is surprising in its own right, what really caught us off guard was the fact that she was crying. See, we knew this guardswoman, both as a fellow passenger on the occurrence border and as one of the few survivors of a rather unsuccessful mission to purge some gene stealers. She was originally from Nabi Regiment and had one of those 30-syllable names, but we just called her Amy. Now, if any of us had been asked to describe Amy, we'd have used the words like solid, professional, and dangerous. Never hysterical or weepy or inclined to hug random non-coms. I mean, it was a commonly held belief that she'd salute her own mother every night before going to bed, which sort of made sense when you remembered that her mother was a Lord General. Anyways, the point is that her breakdown was more terrifying than anything. Sarge disengaged himself and, as politely as possible, asked Amy why the hell she was here. Last any of us had heard, her team had been further towards Tau space and had been one of those to go MIA. Nubby chimed in and pointed out that everyone thought she was dead. Twitch suggested that maybe she was and asked Fumbles to check if she was a ghost. This triggered another round of hysterical giggling and got Twitch a hug of his own, which terrified the demolition trooper. The reunion was brought to a halt when the tech priest rolled over to us with his servitor posse. In typical high-ranking cogboy fashion, he commanded everyone to shut up and take him to the shuttle.
Our presence was not ideal, but could be made to serve the Omnissiah. This triggered another shift from hysterical to furious in Amy. This time we were in a better position to understand what was being said. The main thread of the argument seemed to be that the Magos had gotten everyone killed, refused to call in for backup, and gotten themselves stranded on an empty world for his bloody metal god. Amy was done serving the Omnissiah. For his part, the cogboy who Sarge finally recognized as the Xenotech hunting Magos had been part of our expedition, turned his vocoder to maximum volume and tried to counter each individual point. Why he was doing this was a mystery, because everything he said just made Amy angrier and convinced us that this guy was a complete tool. The bullshit about how his mission couldn't be jeopardized by bringing in unbelievers or how he was not responsible for the behavior of organics was bad enough, but the crowning moment of tooldom was when he pointed to the three familiar-looking servitors and claimed that Amy's companions, quote-unquote, still retain the majority of bodily functions. That neatly answered the question of where the Arbaiti and clerics she'd been teamed up with had gone to. Over the next few minutes, things degraded even further as Tink started needling the tech priest as well. Sarge was about ready to step in and end this shouting match one way or another when Twitch slided up next to him. In the quietest and calmest voice he could manage, Twitch told Sarge that these guys weren't the movement he'd spotted and he was fairly sure that we were being watched. He asked if we could, very casually, start falling back into a more defensible position. Sarge looked around at the floor to ceiling windows on 3 of the walls around us and agreed that might be a good idea. Employing the entirety of his acting talent, Sarge announced that some fresh air might calm everyone down. Nubby took the hint and grabbed Amy while Sarge tried to chive the Magos out of the shop. When that didn't work, he just got behind the tech priest and started pushing until he got the point. Twitch, trying to keep his head from swiveling like a nervous pigeon, set his eyes on a sturdy-looking garage and led the way. Twitch casually gave a hand signal as he walked. Tink correctly interpreted this as an order to send his stealth drone, and Fumbles got the point after Nubby kicked him in the shin. The psyker swayed a little and tripped over a curb, but when we hauled him onto his feet, he shook his head and muttered about everything looking clear. At the back of the group, the shouting match continued. Even though Amy's heart wasn't obviously in it anymore, she picked up on what was happening and everyone could tell that she was trying to hide the fact that she was terrified. The only people that were oblivious to the change of the atmosphere were the tech priests. The Magos had really started picking up steam now that Amy was distracted. He was loudly bad-mouthing just about everyone and made it very hard to concentrate on looking casual. We'd reached the edge of the garage when Tink made a sort of high-pitched wheezing sound and went pale. Everyone took the hint and started power-walking towards the opening. Well, almost everyone. At the back of the group, the Magos and his servitors had come to a halt, and the tech priest was in full monologue mode. He stood there, stock still and surrounded by his herd of servitors, and loudly declared his genius, devotion, and general craziness to the rest of the world. As he entered the safety of the garage, Sarge glanced back at the Magos, then at Tink, who shook his head violently. Sarge sighed, grabbed a smoke grenade, and chucked it at the Magos' feet at the exact same moment the sniper fired. The shot was perfectly aimed. A nearly invisible las beam came at the Magos at eye level. It would have been a clean kill if it hadn't been for a refractor shield. There was a blinding flash where a beam met the shield, and the tech priest started screaming orders at his servitors. Now that the charade was over, Sarge asked for a sit rep as everyone got their weapons ready. Tink claimed that there were 2 hostiles wearing some sort of stealth suits and carrying rifles,
neither of them had line of sight inside the garage. Their stealth was damn good, so there was probably more you hadn't spotted, but they either couldn't hit us or were all focused on the Magos. Speaking of the Magos, he apparently decided not to join us in our cover and had hunkered down in the smoke with his servitors. The 6 meat puppets had formed a sort of wall around him and were firing indiscriminate barrage into the surrounding area. It didn't look like they had any real idea as to where the snipers were, and as we watched, 2 of the servitors went down to incredibly well-placed shots. Our desire to go out there to help him dropped sharply. All of us were familiar with sniper and counter-sniper tactics. Tink was told to continue sweeping for hostiles, and Fumbles was ordered to do likewise. The theory was that once we had their location, we could lay down some suppressive fire and start flanking. Until we knew where all the snipers were, even if none of them had a shot at us yet, we were effectively pinned. Unfortunately, something about these hostiles had Fumbles stumped. He could barely even locate the ones Tink had spotted. The little guy gritted his teeth and pumped more psych into his detection field. But we all felt a wave of despair from him as only succeeded in covering himself in painful sheet of static electricity. Outside, another servitor dropped to a headshot and the Magos started yelling at us to help him. It was officially time to either shit or get off the pot. At our current rate, the Magos was going to be dead before we had all the snipers localized. The more pragmatic member of the squad pointed out that it wasn't such a bad thing and suggested that we run for the shuttle while he drew fire. But Sarge vetoed this perfectly valid plan. At his order, everyone popped smoke and split into 2 teams. Sarge, Amy, and Twitch pushed out and started laying suppressive fire and grenades into the rough locations Tink had given him. Tink, Nuvi, and Fumbles went out the back and tried to flank the snipers between us and the shuttle. Meanwhile, Jim ordered his 3 skulls to help the drone search the area, warmed up the shuttle's perimeter defenses, and relayed the situation to the ship. Everything started out so well. The 2 snipers immediately stopped firing. Tink managed to spot a third and put a plasma bolt through the bastard's cover, and our flankers were almost in position. It was really looking like we were going to be able to neutralize the hostiles, or at least get the Magos out and start a nice orderly retreat. Then, 2 things happened and everything went to shit. At first, we thought the snipers had popped smokes of their own and were falling back. The buildings they were holed up in went sort of hazy and vague, but the fog didn't drift, and a second later the snipers resumed firing from inside the cloud. Another servitor went down and Twitch's grenade detonated in mid-arc. Fumbles screamed, "Psyker!" At the exact moment, a las cannon fired. Las cannon really isn't the right word, but damned if we could think of a better one. Las cannon typically fires a large, powerful, and brief beam. This thing was barely larger than a multi-laser and walked in a brief arc across the battlefield. It just sliced through everything it touched. Walls, lampposts, the car Sarge was hiding behind, servitors, and tech priests. Sarge laid there for a second, trying to blink away the purple after image and get his bearings. He was lying on the ground and was apparently inside of a car. He looked out the side window, which was oddly level with his head, and saw some sort of red and chrome spider monster flailing towards him. Sarge tried to turn his lasgun towards the new threat, but it was wedged against the roof of the car. He futilely pushed at the roof with his hands, then his legs, as the spider thing inched closer with its metal legs. At the last second, a pair of hair-thin beams stabbed into the spider and it fell to the ground. Sarge breathed a sigh of relief, which turned into a choking scream when something tightened across his throat. Twitch hauled Sarge out from underneath the decapitated car by the collar. It was an impressive feat given their relative size and unhelpful way the big man was flailing around. The servitor was scragged. Those last sniper shots seemed to have finished off the cogboy, and there was no telling what the Psyker or las cannon would do next. In his professional opinion, it was time to live it to fight another day. Twitch hit Sarge with an emergency stim while Amy popped her last smoke. Under its cover, they half-carried Sarge back to the relative safety of the garage. Once inside, Amy kept her long las trained on the smoke-filled entrance, while Twitch tried to fill everyone in on the situation. Before he got 2 words out, the las cannon cut through the entire building at shoulder height. The flanking team was having better luck, all things considered. Jim's skulls were hounding the sniper Tink had flushed out, and Fumbles had a rough bead on the enemy Psyker. Tink sent his drones to get the exact position and charged up his plasma gun, while Nubby and Fumbles poured las fire into the psychic shrieks into the cloud concealing the 2 active snipers. Their accuracy was abysmal, but their angle and their attack of sheer volume of fire was enough to force the hostiles to rebase. None of them realized how bad the situation had gotten until they heard Twitch's warning get cut off by a second las cannon strike. In an uncharacteristic act of bravery, Nubby led the charge back towards the garage, taking Fumbles with him and leaving Tink on overwatch. Jim diverted his Metaskull to follow them, then sent the rest of his minions to find Lascan before it could fire again. They found the building teetering alarmingly, but still upright, and with Sarge standing in the middle, barking at the other 2 troopers to get back on their feet. Back in the garage, Sarge was dealing with a minor mutiny. He was of the opinion that the Magos was still alive and pickup needed to be made. Twitch and Amy disagreed. Nubby got to the door just in time to hear the non-com shout that the Magos was still moving and could be saved if they hurried. Amy countered this argument by hefting her long las and putting a hot shot through the head of the twitching tech priest. Further debate was delayed by the roof caving in. There's nothing like a few tons of collapsing stone to motivate a hasty retreat. Nubby, as usual, led the sprint back to Twitch's position with a stemmed up Sarge hard on his heels and the rest of the group trailing behind. None of us even registered Jim's question over the comms. As we regrouped, Tink's drone finally found his target. A large blob of overcharged plasma sailed across the plaza and into a tasteful little restaurant. Instead of just burning through the building, it splashed against something in the back with a crackling explosion. Tink cheered, then swore, then yelled something about tackle and burst into laughter. Twitch barely managed to pull him down in time. The sniper's shot cut a neat little notch into the techie's helmet. Now, none of us wanted to start this shit again. Fumbles threw up a half-assed cloak, and we all started falling back towards the shuttle in pairs. Now that we knew what we were looking for, we could see 3 distinct blurs poking in and out of cover. We did our best to return fire as we ran, but the buggers had nerves of steel. For every 10 shots we put down range, they returned one incredibly well-aimed one. Only the combination of our cover, Fumble's cloak, and the huge amount of suppressive fire kept us alive. That's not to say we got out of there unscathed. Those hair-thin las bolts nailed everyone at least once. If you stuck a toe outside cover, they'd shoot it, and if you didn't, they'd try to punch right through it. The only one of us who managed to score a hit on them was Amy, and the second time she tried to line up a shot, her long las exploded in her hands as they put a shot down the barrel. Stopping and waiting for Jim's Metaskull, which had gone emperor knows where during the retreat, was out of the question. So Sarge wound up popping another stim and carrying her for the last sprint to the shuttle. We all felt a tremendous relief when the shuttle's multi-lasers finally forced the snipers to back off. As we reached the top of the shuttle's loading ramp, Twitch asked if anyone knew what happened to the las cannon. Right on cue, a section of the bulkhead started glowing, then the damn beam punched through with a spray of molten metal. Jim didn't bother waiting for an order. The engines roared to life with our big, ungangly shuttle started to wallow upwards. As the rear ramp began to close, the las cannon fired again and neatly burnt through its hydraulics. Everyone resisted the urge to poke their heads out of the broken door to see what was shooting the beams at us. At this point, Tink, who'd been rather focused on not getting shot like the rest of us, realized that someone was missing. He yanked the drone controllers off his harness and started screaming at Jim to slow down. Jim correctly interpreted this as a terrible idea and ignored it. Everyone who was collapsing from blood loss or stim after effects watched as the techie frantically slammed at the drone's controls and screamed curses. The show was briefly interrupted when a las cannon burned through the floor about 10 meters in front of Tink's feet, but resumed after a few evasive maneuvers slammed us around like pinballs. It didn't take a savant to see that Tink was losing his race. Spot the Wonder Drone was great at stealth and recon, but it wasn't built for this sort of speed. Nubby clomped over and put his hand on the techie shoulder. He suggested that maybe Tink should park the drone somewhere where he'd be able to come back and get it in a few years. Tink whirled around and had his drone controller raised like a club when the las cannon fired again. The shuttle pitched forward as the tail of the vessel exploded in a fireball. The difference in attitude between Tink and the rest of us when the las cannon took our tail engine was profound. While everyone else screamed, clutched at the safety handles, or prayed to the Emperor, he let out a whoop of joy and ran to the jammed ramp. A few sniper beams sailed past him and were ignored in favor of a small tan shape which, now that our speed had been cut in half, was steadily growing larger. Tink cooed at the damn thing like a puppy, which was admittedly better than a girlfriend, but still. As it closed the last dozen meters, he spread his arms wide and tried to catch it, only to get knocked off his feet as a smaller and faster object sailed through. The drone followed a second later and slammed into Twitch, who had been holding on to dear life in the far corner. Tink sat up and groped at the object that had knocked him on his ass. He raised two bloody-covered hands, registered that he was holding a severed head attached to a metaskull, and started screaming. Jim appeared in the hatch leading to the cockpit, asked if the Magos had made it aboard. The cockboy barely managed to reach the gooey thing away from Tink before it was chucked out the tail hatch. Jim held the Mago's head up like some sort of trophy and turned to face charge with a rather profound expression on his face. Unfortunately, our barely conscious leader wasn't able to offer any suitable praise. All he managed was a barely...
Who's flying the shuttle?
Jim swore and ran back into the cockpit, barely managing to dodge the next las cannon beam. Thankfully, that was a last shot. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief and slumped into their seats. Well, more like gasped for relief. We were all pretty out of breath and our ears were hurting for some reason. Tink eyed all the holes in the cargo bay and kicked the rest of us to our feet. We wound up packing 7 people and, for some damned reason, the drone into a 2-man cockpit. It wasn't comfortable, but at least there was air. Between the sweating, bleeding people, the Mago's severed head, and Nubby's unique, indescribable odor that the cockpit was getting pretty manky by the time we reached the occurrence border. As soon as the bay was pressurized, we piled out and collapsed on the first available surface. The ship's air, which always smelt faintly of burnt cabbage, had never tasted so sweet. The Hospitaller and her minions were waiting for us in the docking bay, along with a disconcertingly high number of tech priests. Thinking fast, if not hard, Tink jammed the techno-heretical drone up the front of his shirt, which made him look pregnant and caused a fair bit of amusement amongst the orderlies. None of the cogboys seemed to notice, and after they'd taken possession of the Magos' head, for data extraction, they said, all of them left without incident. Sarge tried to follow them, but only got a few meters before the Hospitaller neatly tripped him into a gurney. The incredibly fluffy pillow defeated any further attempts to refuse treatment. While the burns Amy had received with her long las exploding got most of the attention, all of us wound up getting hauled to the med bay by Doc's Valkyrian girlfriend. Well, except for Jim, who tagged along with the other tech priest to keep an eye on his sample? Trophy? Rescue? Well, whatever you call the head of your Mediskull had sawn off the still warm body of his patient. Seriously, that right there, that's why no one trusts those things. Anyways, everyone except Sarge was stuck in the medbay for a while. Despite their size, those sniper beams had just as nasty as any laser gun, and it was surprising how many holes we had in us. Sarge was set loose after a basic patch job and yet another stimulant, thankfully not a combat one this time, to go talk to the adepts and the other interrogators. Doc made him promise to come back for a complete round of treatment the second the situation was resolved. Speaking of Doc, he was rather happy to see us all again. Nubby filled him in with the basics of what had happened, with twitch and fumbles correcting the occasional exaggeration. Doc was just as surprised as the rest of us had been when we got to the part about running into Amy and the Magos. He wheeled over to where she was being treated by the hospitaller just to verify we weren't bullshitting him. In his semi-professional medical opinion, she was in for a rough few days as they sped grow the skin on her face and arms, but she would recover without much scarring or needing any augmetics. He claimed his girlfriend had a lot of experience treating burns, something about working with trainee dominions. While the rest of us chatted with Doc, Tink had pulled the screen around his bed and loudly threatened to shoot anyone who looked inside. Occasionally, the nurses would look up at the loud clinking sounds and the do not disturb sign and then start giggling. When the humor of the situation wore off and the noise was starting to get really annoying, we stilled our nerves and went to see what he was doing in there. We found Tink with the drone between his legs, thankfully with his pants on. He was trying to pop out an impressive dent in the front of Spot's chassis. When we'd asked how it happened, he reminded us of the enemy psyker he'd taken out. It used some sort of shield to deflect his plasma bolt and looked like it was about to launch its own attack, so he had Spot ram the bastard. It's hard to cast spells when you got 50 kilos of angry drone bashing your head in. Turns out the psyker had one hell of a helmet though, hence the dent. Still, it convinced the warpy bastard that it was time to fall back, so he was calling it a win. Doc, who'd been eyeing the lens next to the dent, cut into the story at this point, and then asked if that meant that he had a clear picture of the attackers. Tink shrugged and admitted that he probably did, but so did the adepts who'd been watching the feed. They'd get around to telling us who it was eventually, and he was the only one who couldn't fix this dent, so his priorities were clear. The rest of us were a little more curious, so Nubby yanked the spanner out of Tink's hand and refused to give it back until he pulled up the vid feed of the ramming. After a little fast-forwarding, he found it and everyone crowded around the data slate. We were treated to a view of a small room with a blurry figure standing in the middle of it and gesturing. As we watched, the blur was replaced by a large circular shield and the screen went blindingly bright. When the flash faded, there was a tall robed figure with a sword and an egg-shaped helmet standing there panting. He raised his sword, gathered some sort of lightning around it, and then the drone hit him right in the back of his stupid hat. Other Inquisitional agents might have sat there and carefully examined the psyker's robes or weapons for clues. We just kept having Tink rewind it so we could see the headbutt again. When he got the sound turned on, it made a great sort of hollow clang every time the drone hit him. There was much debate over which was the best part, the initial impact or the part where his head went through the drywall and got stuck. Either way, it was the best show we'd seen in a long time. We wound up pulling the vid on repeat on all the screens in the medbay. It was very therapeutic to see the bastard flailing his fancy sword around in an attempt to fend off the drone and cut his head free at the same time. At Twitch's urging, Tink even etched a little egg helmet face on the side of Spot's chassis to commemorate the event. Everyone was in remarkably good spirits considering we were stuck in a medbay for the foreseeable future. Well, except for Amy, who was still tranked up for the worst part of her burn treatment. Fumbles tried to send her a mental image of the whole thing as she slept, but Doc made him stop after a nearby diagnostics cogitator caught fire. While the rest of us were laughing ourselves sick over the Inquisition's funniest home videos, Sarge was attending a very serious meeting with some very serious people. You could tell they were serious because none of them even smiled when the adepts played the drone ramming clip for them. They just muttered to each other about which craft world the Eldar Warlock had come from and what possible hand they could have in everything. Sarge primarily contributed to this discussion by resting his head on the table and agreeing with anything our team's adepts said. In Sarge's opinion, the other two interrogators were putting way too much effort in trying to understand the Eldar's motives. They'd gone through the vids from Tink's drone and Jim's skulls frame by frame to determine that there had been a warlock, 3 rangers, and some sort of heavy weapon team operating a Bright Lance. There was a little debate at the last point, since all of Jim's drones had been shot before they could get a good picture. Neither of the other teams had run into any hostiles, and they hadn't spotted anything when they'd done a flyby of the island, so it looked like that was that for the ground assets. Sword Guy half-heartedly suggested that the Eldar could be behind the disappearances. They were Xenos with access to warp powers and archaeotech after all. He didn't press the issue when Sarge grumpily asked then why they didn't use their creepy silhouette leaving people disappear instead of shooting at us with fancy las guns. Battle Axe claimed that the small size of their force suggested that they were an assassination team. Given their attack pattern, location, and the fact that no one else of importance was nearby, their target must have been the Magos. From his spot at the end of the table, Sarge grumbled that he'd told everyone the Xenos had been trying to kill the tech priest an hour ago. Battle Axe ignored him and pointed out that the real question was whether this was connected to the disappearances and if it was because Magos had known something. Rather annoyed at having been ignored, Sarge sarcastically suggested that they'd asked the Magos that question. To his considerable surprise, everyone took this seriously, with the sword guy even asking his psyker if he was capable of leading a seance. The debate over whether the ritual was more likely to result in useful information or a demon manifestation was still raging when the tech priests arrived. Just saying they arrived doesn't do it justice. Every single cogboy over the rank of engine seer on the occurrence border walked, rolled, floated, or slithered into the meeting room. The ratio of metal to meat in there hit 50-50 in the first few seconds, and climbed towards 80-20 when Jim brought up the rear of the procession. Sarge took notice of how nervous the young cogboy looked as, at an order from a senior tech priest, he sealed the door behind him. It occurred to the blurry non-com that a bunch of guardsmen had done something like this. It would have been because an officer was about to become a friendly fire statistics. Sarge edged his chair away from the table and towards the most defensible corner he could find and casually put one hand in his pocket. No one except Jim paid him any attention. The agency leaned out from behind his seniors and awkwardly tried to indicate that this was not the time to pull out a grenade. Or possibly that his neck hurt and he wanted to lie down for a while. Jim was bad at guard hand signals. After a bit of unpleasant silence, the coggiest of the cogboys finally decided the tension had built to acceptable levels. In a loud, authoritative, and entirely synthetic voice, he proclaimed that the seance would not be necessary. They'd extracted all relevant data from Magos' ID Tech memory chip. he sort of stopped there with no explanations of what the data actually was, leaving the non-metallic portion of the room awkwardly waiting. The second the battle axe began to ask, the head tech priest cut her off with a shout of,
"That information is sacred. It contains profound secrets. Surely for those who not venerating on Messiah in his true form would be heretical."
The cog boys behind him echoed the words sacred, secrets, and heretical like a shitty backup singers. Sarge let out a weary sigh and rubbed his aching temples. It was going to be a long meeting. When Sarge finally staggered back into the medbay, he looked bloody exhausted. He pretty much collapsed on the first available bed, and at his request, we stopped the continuous loop of the warlock getting his head stuck in the drywall. Doc gave some sort of overdue medical treatment while he filled us in on the situation. To start with, he gave us the official word that we'd been shot full of holes by an Eldar hit squad. Nubby fist bumped and loudly started calculating what his and Bumble's share of the pool was. Sarge immediately crushed his happy speculation with the news that the Eldar weren't the cause of the attacks, and had only been there for the Magos unless Amy could tell them otherwise. No one would be collecting on the pool anytime soon, and unless there was a second group of Eldar, Nubby's odds weren't looking good. While Nubby whined to himself, the discussion shifted to the Magos, his decapitation, and the tech priests. According to Sarge, all of them, even Jim, had to gear up their ass about something they'd gotten out of the Magos' head. It'd been like pulling teeth to get anything out of them. They kept falling back on the whole, "we technically only have to answer to the Inquisitor, so go get an order from him" argument. In the end, all they were willing to part with was that the Magos was chasing a piece of Archaeotech and had tracked it into the Xenos territory. He'd intercepted some reports that confirmed the nature of the Archaeotech and the heresies the Xenos had committed on it. He'd then sent a report to the proper authorities and was still tracking the Archaeotech when he was killed by the vile Eldar. Finally, the nature of the tech was not for us to know, but it would not cause the sort of disappearances we'd seen. We should turn our investigations elsewhere. The priest had refused to say anything more. The proper authorities had been notified, and the matter should then be left to them. Further probing into the Mechanicus' holy secrets would be unwise. It had taken a heroic effort by the other two interrogators and the old diplomat adept to convince the tech priest that their warnings were understood. The entire army of cogboys had left secured in the knowledge that no one would be poking into their business, and that everyone would be focused on the completely unconnected matter of the disappearances. The second they were gone, one of the psychers had done something that made the room sound all weird, and the diplomat had asked for a show of hands.
"Who here,"
he asked,
"thinks we're looking for a piece of insanely dangerous Archaeotech that's either wiping all intelligent life off worlds, or is being pursued by someone who is willing to do something to keep it a secret?"
The eyes had it by a landslide. Sarge said it was nice to be reminded that not everyone in the Inquisition was stupid or insane. In the end, the working theory was that someone was hauling this thing from Tau space to the Imperium via warp ship. Whether it was to sell, study, worship, or use as a weapon on Imperial worlds was up to debate, but it was obvious that the Mechanicus and the Eldar were both chasing it. It was impressive that whoever was carrying it was managing to stay ahead of both of them. The fact that they were evading pursuit probably explained the semi-random course across the border worlds, though. The question was what to do about it. And there was no way we'd back off and let the Admex handle things. Imperial worlds were getting wiped out like the ones we just visited. It just wasn't acceptable. The only options were to try to catch the carriers in a stern chase, try to protect their next destination and set an ambush, or go get some real reinforcements and try to lock down the entire subsector. Debates were had, charts were consulted, the captain was called down, and 3 possible destinations were laid out. The captain was in favor of getting reinforcements and wanted us to chart a course to the largest Imperial world along the border. Battle-axe and sword guy thought too much damage would be done before a response was mustered. She wanted us to try and jump ahead to a refueling way station that looked like it might be in the right direction. He wanted to head towards a nearby Imperial world with a rather untrusted governor that might be either the target or a buyer. Sarge, who was barely awake enough to follow what was going on, wound up being the tiebreaker. When all 3 of his adepts just shrugged, Sarge had fallen back on his non-com instincts. He stood straight, squared his shoulders, and stabbed his finger in the middle option of the chart. Sarge loudly declared that it was the only real choice, then retreated back up to the medbay before anyone realized that he'd just randomly picked one. None of us saw any problem with this decision-making process. In the morning, or whatever you call it when the shift slice jumped from 10% to max power and the captain blares reveille over the comm system, Sarge got around to debriefing Amy. She told a fairly unpleasant tale of wandering around the ass end of the sector as the Magos did his thing. Amy and her team had been treated like mushrooms. That is to say, kept in the dark and fed horseshit. They'd never learned anything about the mission aside from the fact that the Archaeotech was involved, and had mostly spent the time being shot at by over a dozen different groups, ranging from gangers to planetary police forces. It wasn't some sort of giant conspiracy though. The Magos just didn't give a shit. If there was something in his way, he'd just throw bodies at it all day long if it meant getting through quicker. He wasn't too particular where those bodies came from either. If his teams couldn't handle a problem, he'd improvise. Amy claimed she'd never look at a servitors the same way again. The next to last straw for Amy had been an ambush by what she now recognized as Eldar. They'd killed off the last of her teammates and forced a retreat into a merchant vessel. The Magos had then proceeded to intimidate and bully the merchant into taking him on a tour of the empty worlds. To no one but the Magos' surprise, that relationship had ended with the merchant ditching them at the first opportunity, hence the island. She'd been stuck there alone with him, well, him and the servitors' converted bodies of her teammates, for a month. The real kicker was the bastard had sort of an interstellar communicator the whole time. He used it to put in a call for the nearest Forge world, but had refused to contact anyone else after the merchant incident. So yeah, all that went a long ways to explaining the hysterics in the head shooting incident. The end of the story though was that Amy had no real new intel. Between obvious clues, well, obvious for our adepts, and that incredibly unsubtle warning from the Cogboys, we knew just as much as she did. Speaking of that warning, it had been awfully convenient that the tech priest had decided to give it to us instead of just staying quiet. We all suspected that Jim and Hannah had some hand in the matter, but neither of them were talking to us currently. As the least shot members of the squad, Nubby, and by extension Fumbles, had been sent to chat with the 2 junior tech priests after they didn't visit us in the medbay. When Nubby returned, he claimed that every time he tracked one of them down, they'd gotten really nervous expressions and ran for it. He'd given up after Jim had locked him and Fumbles in a section of a maintenance corridor. Also, if old Bill came asking why one of his tech priests had a massive headache and why there were reports of warp ghosts on Deck 8, that had nothing to do with him or Fumbles getting tired of waiting for the doors to open again. The destination Sarge had chosen, which turned out to be the way station, was a solid week of warp travel away. After about the second day, everyone was tired of sitting around the medbay with Doc and his lady friend, so we moved back to our nice Gellerfield generator adjacent quarters. Doc complained a little that our treatment, especially Amy's, weren't finished. But we'd figured that coming down and making a few house calls would be good for him. He'd been getting soft in that chair all day. Some exercise would do him some good. Sarge spent most of the next week putting together reports and contingency plans with the adepts and interrogators. But he spared some time, though, for Jim and Hana. He interpreted their junior tech priest's behavior as a sign that their bosses were acting crazier than usual over the whole thing, and made a note to keep an eye on them. Intimidating impressionable young tech priest was our shtick. Since sending Nubby, Twitch, or Tink to watch them was likely going to do more harm than good, some words were had with old Bill and the captain. The duty roster was shuffled, and several unintrusive armsmen and engine seers were assigned to the same shift as our cog bros. It might have been a bit of a paranoid over-precaution, but that's sort of what being a guardsman in the Inquisition is all about. Nubby and his partner in petty crime wandered around the ship a lot during our transit. Anyone with enough brains to pour water out of a boot could tell that they were planning to sabotage the betting pool in some way before their inevitable loss. But it wasn't worth doing anything about, as long as Nubby didn't egg fumbles into changing someone's mind for them again. It was about as harmless as a pastime as they were likely to find. Tink and Twitch's lives over the next week generally revolved around our new barracks mate. Tink, who seemed a little lonely now that Jim wasn't there to argue with him, had fixed Spot's chassis and replaced its servo-grok skull disguise before the end of the second day. After that, he went back to work on the Xenos pulse rifle camouflage project and seized on Amy as a guinea pig. She was in the market for a new weapon after all, and it was so much easier to cram a pulse rifle into a long-last chassis than a regular lasgun. They spent quite a while blowing holes in various objects and bath-mouthing tech priests. Twitch was just glad to have an actual reason to distrust servitors and turned the barracks' defenses up from 11 to about 13. Sarge called for a slight de-escalation when he started putting small remote charges on every servitor he encountered, just in case they turned en masse. Apparently Jim and Hannah were the ones who had to find and defuse them. On the 7th day, Sarge and the other interrogators put everyone in a 1-hour lure and prepped the shuttles for immediate launch. The jury was still out on what we were likely to find when we came out of the warp, but if the target was docked at the station, we wanted to neutralize it before it moved again. Also before it attracted a bunch of angry Xenos, demons, or cogboys. The occurrence border came out of the warp at the coordinates where the way station Illumitem Octavus was supposed to be, and found the station to be missing. In its place, there was a pitched space battle being fought between an Imperial vessel and an unidentifiable Xeno ship. A quick inspection of the system turned up the missing station, further back in its orbit of the local star than it should have been. In fact, a quick scan revealed that it wasn't in orbit at all. It was moving in a nice straight line, right down the gravity well. The captain estimated it had passed the point of no return about 4 hours ago, and would start burning in around 30. He refused to speculate on what sort of weapon or magic could just cancel an entire station's orbital velocity. As for the ships, our initial instincts was to go help the Imperial vessel, but that was quelled by the captain. He reminded everyone that the only way the occurrence border would win a naval engagement was if the other ship spontaneously exploded before it fired its first broadside. If it exploded afterwards, the fight would probably be a draw. Furthermore, the ship was looking less and less like it needed our help the longer we looked at it. It was definitely a lot bigger than its opponent, and it was throwing out a staggering amount of firepower. Sure, it seemed to be missing the smaller ship with every shot, but nothing the Xenos was throwing out was making it past their void shields. Also, it was squawking stuff like,
10100110110.
Oh, chaos!
10100111010.
Across all Vox channels, and the Astropath refused to tell anyone what he was hearing. The tech priest on duty on the bridge had immediately declared them heretics, and then left his post to go talk to the other cogboys. No one bothered to stop him. It was really looking like our best option was to just jump right back out of the system and head somewhere else less creepy. Well, that's what certainly the captain recommended anyways. Except there was the tempting little matter of the station. It was the only thing in the system those ships could possibly be fighting over, and neither was in a position to stop us from taking a quick look. It was a stupid idea, and it's a miracle we survived. The captain had stubbornly refused to get any closer to either the station or the fighting ships than necessary. The occurrence border was positioned at nearly the maximum distance from the station his shuttles could travel, and sat there with its engines and warp drives spun up. In the captain's words,
"If anyone even looks at me funny, I'm leaving you stupid bastards to die."
With those encouraging words ringing in our ears, everyone boarded their shuttle and went to see what was so special about way station Aluminum Octavis. It says something about how distracted everyone was, that we were cruising for about a quarter of an hour before we realized Jim was the one flying and Hannah was the co-pilot. The reunion was sort of spoiled by a little note taped to the cockpit door saying, quote, "The shuttle is monitored. Talk and move as little as possible. Wait for us to give the word." After a long, awkward wait, Jim finally came back and announced that he'd looped something or other, and we could talk. Hannah refused to leave the cockpit, even though we promised Tink wouldn't do anything weird. Amy opened the conversation with a polite, "What the hell is going on here, you metal bastard?" but relented when Sarge vouched for Jim as the broest of cog bros. The explanation that followed was quick, obviously well rehearsed, and fairly terrifying. The gist of it was that the ship's tech priests weren't just antsy, they were on the edge of mutiny. Jim hadn't seen the actual data they'd pulled out of the Magos, but whatever this piece of archaeotech was, it had particularly driven his seniors to a schism. Some of the cog boys wanted the tech destroyed, others wanted to lock it away, and a few wanted to study it. The only thing preventing an immediate free-for-all was the fact that the thing wasn't here, and that the Magos had reported it to someone named Juris. The senior tech priest had eventually agreed to wait for Juris to decide and abide by his decision. Unless, that is, it looked like the archaeotech might fall into someone else's hands. Like, say, the Inquisitions? Less holy men, such as us or Jim, might see the ship's senior tech priests as arrogant, socially stunted, and quite possibly insane. But they were not stupid. They knew that we'd keep chasing the archaeotech and would allow us to continue, for now, but were monitoring all the team's shuttles and comms. If any of us found information relating to the archaeotech or its location, we'd be given a single chance to turn it over. If we refused, Jim and the other tech priests piloting the other shuttles had orders to cut our comms and return to the ship, leaving all three teams to cook on the falling station. In his words,
"The Magos Joas must decide this matter. Anything else will result in a schism. When the Mechanicus schisms, Titans walk, and worlds burn. My superiors will see you all dead before they allow that."
After everyone had digested this speech for a while, Nubby put on his weaseliest smile and asked Jim if he'd really do that to his old pals. The flat look he got back from the engine seer was incredibly worrying, especially coupled with how Jim turned around and went back into the cockpit without saying anything else. So anyways, that's why when we finally reached the station, our team decided to stay in the shuttle while the others went on ahead. They could probably handle anything out there without us. Sarge loudly announced to the other teams that he intended to do a visual inspection of the station. For space stuff. The other interrogators agreed it was a good idea, but none of us thought of it as anything more than an excuse not to get marooned on a rapidly falling chunk of metal by crazy cogboys. So it was quite a surprise when we cleared the corner and saw the Heretech shuttle already docked to the station. We managed to call in the sighting just in time to keep the other teams from blundering into a bunch of heavily armed servitors and a tentacly tech priest. According to TeknoAXESongs, the Heretech seemed to be searching for something, stopping and doing creepy stuff to every cogitator or comm terminal he encountered. They decided that following the search party and seeing what it turned up was the best use of their time, and switching their comms to stealth mode. We wished them luck and continued our inspection. Now, this is where some less imaginative people would have blown up the dock shuttle, but we were suspicious bastards. Sure enough, a little more searching turned up nearly a dozen more shuttles, all of them heavily armed, but dormant for now. In our professional opinion, 12 to 3 wasn't good odds, even without factoring how much better armed they were than us, so Sarge decided to let sleeping shuttles lie and called in a warning to the ground teams, advising them not to engage. Battle Axe interrupted and asked him to repeat the message. It was hard to hear over all the shooting. Luckily, Sarge's facepalm turned out to be premature. Neither ground team was actually involved in the battle. They were just watching some third party shoot 7 types of hell out of the patrol. The question of who the Heretechs were fighting was answered by the sight of a familiar las cannon beam stabbing out of the station's hull a short distance away. Amy summed up everyone's opinion of the development with an incredible streak of swearing. Different people are curious about different things. Sword Guy was wondering what sort of convoluted plot the Eldar were running. Battle Axe was curious about what the Heretech was looking for in the cogitators. Our team didn't worry about that sort of complex bullshit. We just wanted to know how the Eldar had gotten onto the station because we sure as hell didn't see any other shuttles out here. Thanks to the adepts, we all knew the pointy-eared bastards like to use fancy hidden teleporting web dillies to get around. But that's not the sort of thing you find tucked in the corner of a human waste station. Either their teleporters had range from where their ship was duking it out with the Heretics, which Jim claimed to be incredibly unlikely, or someone was trying to be sneaky. Guardsmen don't like it when other people are sneaky. It typically ends with us getting shot in the back, so we decided to take a harder look at the station. Since we didn't want to alert anyone of our presence out here, our moderately untrustworthy pilots did what they called a passive scan. We understood this to be the equivalent of looking really hard at something, but not going as so far as to throw rocks to check for mines. Unfortunately, while it didn't blow our cover, it also didn't turn up anything. Sarge was debating ordering some figurative rock throwing when Tink announced that it was time to use some real scanners built by real scientists. Jim hastily leaned out and tapped his "You are being monitored" sign before Tink finished pulling off Spot's skulls. There was an awkward, sort of pantomimed argument, in which Jim managed to convey that he couldn't turn the cameras off again, and Tink managed to convey that Jim was a colossal metal asshole. In the end, Tink wound up putting on his void helmet and stepping out the lock with his drone before pulling off his disguise. Since no one else had anything better to do, we all clustered around the little airlock window and tried to watch over Tink's shoulder. It wasn't very interesting. All we could see was him poking at the Xenos data slate and muttering to himself. The real action was happening down below us, where the drone engaged its stealth field and started taking some very close looks at the station and the shuttles. Whether it was due to Tink having a bit of experience looking for Eldar with his drone, or pure dumb luck, or because Tau drone tech was really just that good, he found the shuttle that was not like the others in just under 5 minutes. It did not please Jim, who had to endure Tink making faces at him through the cockpit window as he relayed the drone's data. What appeared to be a fairly standard, if gruesomely decorated, Imperial-style shuttle to our eyes looked like a bat-winged xenocraft to Spot the Wonder drone. They had sharp forward-swept wings with odd chunks missing and these weird mandible-looking wings under the cockpit. But that wasn't really what caught our attention. What really caught our attention was the 2 massive las cannons slung under it. This thing didn't have our shuttle's little wing turrets outclassed. It had us completely outschooled. Tink very carefully parked his drone above the Xeno shuttle, and a quick debate over what to do with it was held. It says something about how shaken we were by Jim's little warning that we went with Nubby's idea.